Today's sermon title is called God Will Do It, and we're going to be looking into the whole chapter of 2 Samuel chapter 1. Before we get into the sermon, I just want to tell you guys a little bit about how my parents came to the United States. So back in 2002, our parents flew from Korea. They were in their late 30s, early 40s. They flew from Korea to a little town called South Padre Island. I don't know if you guys heard of. Back then, it wasn't such a big place, but when we went, it was a very small little local town. So we moved with me, my brother, and my sister, and my mom and my dad, a family of 5. We moved to Corpus Christi, South Padre Island, and we spent about a year there. And in that 1 year time period, my parents did a lot of kinds of jobs, like fixing the roofs, delivering bricks from places to places because they didn't have an education. So doing that for a year, they thought, okay, we had enough of labor. So they decided to take us from Corpus Christi to Austin, Texas. So I moved to Austin, Texas in 2004, where I spent a majority of my life there. But my parents' circumstances didn't really change. My parents still struggled doing labor jobs. My dad would transport refrigerators, big refrigerators across home to home. And maybe he would get paid minimum wage. My mom would serve tables every weekend and every weekdays when we were not home in school. When I was watching my family struggle, I realized one thing. And that thing was my parents would meet these other Korean adults. But oftentimes these experiences with them would not be that pleasant. For example, they would be scammed or they would be lied to. One of the reasons that happened because they didn't speak English. They didn't know a single word of English. So a lot of the Korean community took advantages of my parents. So I thought in my head, man, if my parents didn't meet that person, or if my parents never went to that area and met that Korean ajumma, maybe our family would have been a little bit more well off. Maybe without that person, our family would have been a little more comfortable, is what I thought. As we read, you guys didn't read, our whole church is reading 2 Samuel. But in the book of Samuel, we see David being chased by Saul, right? King Saul. King Saul is trying to kill David because David is the next throne to king of Israel. So Saul is being threatened, right? Over the 10 to 15 year period, David gets chased by Saul. So it wouldn't be a surprise for David to think, man, if I didn't meet Saul, my life would have been so comfortable, right? Man, if I didn't encounter Saul, I could have easily been the king of Israel. Well, in 2 Samuel chapter 1, we find that David finds out that Saul had died in a battle. And how David reacts is something that we really have to look into. So that's where we're going to start by reading chapter 1, verse 1 together. Follow me along. I'll read it and you can follow me along. This is 2 Samuel chapter 1, verse 1. After the death of Saul, when David had returned from striking down the Amalekites, David remained 2 days in Ziklag. That's David's original hometown, Ziklag. And this is verse 2. And on the third day, behold, a man came from Saul's camp with his clothes torn and dirt on his head. And when he came to David, he fell on the ground and paid homage. David said to him, "Where do you come from?" And he said to him, "I have escaped from the camp of Israel." And David said to him, How did it go? Tell me. And he answered, "The people fled from the battle, and also many of the people have fallen and are dead. And Saul and his son Jonathan are also dead." I'm going to continue reading chapter 5, verse 5. Then David said to the young man who told him, "How do you know that Saul and his son Jonathan are dead?" Verse 6. And the young man who told him said, we're going to stop right there. Before he said, we're going to stop right there. So Saul, the first king of Israel, finally dies over a long rule. And this happens while he's fighting the Philistines on Mount Gilboa. He's fighting Philistines on Mount Gilboa. And all this happened when David was fighting who? Amalekites. If you read verse 1, he was fighting the Amalekites who had invaded his home in Ziklag. So he's defending his home. And Saul is fighting over in Philistine Mount Gilboa. That's the kind of scene that's being set. When David returned home, this young man rushes to him and bows down and tells him the news that Saul and Jonathan had died in a battle. And surprisingly, he tells the story in great great detail. I'm going to read that detail with you. Go back to where we stopped. He said, and we stopped right there, by chance, I happened to be on Mount Gilboa, and there was Saul leaning on his spear, and behold, the chariots and the horsemen were close upon him. And when he looked behind him, he saw me, and he called to me, and I answered, Here I am. And he said to me, Who are you? I answered him, I am an Amalekite. And he said to me, Stand beside me and kill me, for anguish has seized me, and yet my life still lingers. So I stood beside him and killed him, because I was sure that he could not live after he had fallen. And I took the crown that was on his head and the armlet that was on his arm, and I brought them here to my Lord as in to David. He claims that he saw Saul dying from battle, meaning that he was already injured and he was dying. And Saul had seen this Amalekite man and told him, Hey, kill me, because I'm about to die. But I don't want to die in the hands of my enemy. So he obeyed and killed him. This is his claim, right? One interesting thing that we have to kind of look into is the fact that he's an Amalekite. The reason why this is interesting is because the Amalekites and the Israelites are historical enemies. The Amalekites appear in the times of Israelites when they left Egypt. God, who knew that Satan would use the Amalekites nation to hinder God's work of salvation, said this in Exodus 17:16. The Lord has sworn that the Lord will fight against Amalekites from generation to generations. What does this mean? This means that Amalekites were people who attacked God's people. They invaded the people of Israel. They raided them. They stole their belongings ever since they came out of Egypt. This was not only true for the Israelites, but the Amalekites were the people who visited many other nearby battlefields, searched the corpse of those who have died in wars, took their belongings, jewelries, whatever they had, and sold it so they can make a living off of it. This is who they were historically. So from this historical background, we have to kind of think, maybe this Amalekite isn't so trustworthy. Why? Because historically, they're stealers. Historically, they're thieves. They chase after dead corpses for their own gain. However, the biggest evidence is that the death of Saul described by this young Amalekite is very different from the death of Saul in 1 Samuel verse 31. If you have your Bibles, turn to 1 Samuel verse 31, and I'll read it. You can follow along. Verse 1 Samuel verse 3. The battle pressed hard against Saul, and the archers found him, and he was badly wounded by the archers. Then Saul said to his armor bearer, Draw your sword and thrust me through it, lest these uncircumcised come and thrust me through and mistreat me. So, in 1 Samuel, it's evident that it wasn't some Amalekite that came and killed him, but it was his armor bearer, his fellow soldier, who he requested to kill. When he requested, the soldier declined because he was too scared. So what Saul does here is this. Verse 5. Verse 6. Verse 5. And when his armor bearer saw that Saul was... go back to verse... where we left off. Mistreat me. But his armor bearer would not, for he feared greatly. Therefore Saul took his own sword and fell upon it. Right? It's very different from what the Amalekite has described. The Amalekite said, I killed him. But in 1 Samuel 31, in 1 Samuel 4, it records that he fell on his own sword and took his own life. Not only that, guys, what does verse 31 say? He says, at least these uncircumcised come and thrust me through and mistreat me, meaning that he didn't want to be killed by an uncircumcised man. For the Jews, being killed by an uncircumcised man meant that you're going to hell, that your salvation is declined. Also, if you're killed by a woman, you're also going to hell. So these traditions have forced Saul to not want to be killed by an Amalekite, right? So we know for sure that the Amalekite who was uncircumcised is not telling the true story. Then why is this guy lying to such extent? Why is this young Amalekite lie to David? Well, guys, the news about relationship between David and Saul was no secret. People knew that Saul wanted to kill David, and he had been trying to kill David for over 10 years. This was not hidden. Saul was very vocal about it. Where's David? I'm going to kill David. The Amalekites knew this fact as well. So he thought that David would rejoice in the news that the king that was after his death is no longer alive. You guys following what I'm saying? That David would rejoice and be happy with the fact that Saul is dead. He thought that, man, if I tell the news to David first, not only would he be happy about it, but he would give me a great reward. Good job for killing my enemy. He didn't stop there. He says, if I am the one that killed David, man, how great is that reward going to be? Well, contrary to what the Amalekite expected, David's reaction is quite different, right? Let's read verse 11, back to 2 Samuel chapter 1, verse 11 to 16. Follow me along as I read, okay? Then David took hold of his clothes and tore them, and so did all the men who were with him. And they mourned and wept and fasted until evening for Saul and for Jonathan his son, and for the people of the Lord, and for the house of Israel, because they had fallen by the sword. And David said to the young men who told him, where do you come from? And he answered, I am the son of Sojourner, an Amalekite. David said to him, how is it that you are not afraid to put out your hand to destroy the Lord's anointed? David called one of the young men and said, go, execute him. And he struck him down so that he died. And David said to him, your blood be on your head, for your own mouth has testified against you, saying, I have killed the Lord's anointing. Okay, look back to me now. Everyone who counters someone who gave them a hard time, for example, if you experience somebody who gave you a really, really rough time, it's not that rare, I would say. I would assume that everybody here at one point has encountered somebody that was so hard on you, right? Gave you so much stress and hardships. That may vary depending on people's experience, but it's generally true to say that we've all experienced somebody who's mistreated us. Especially in an immigrant life, it's very common for Korean communities to betray other Korean people and defraud each other. In times like this, we realize that our anger towards that person may be temporary, right? It's short. But our resentment lasts a very long time. If David were human, if he was like us, I think that he would have this kind of resentment towards Saul. He may have thought, man, if it weren't for that person, if it weren't for Saul, I would have been so comfortable. Our emotions that once were in our hearts sometimes become tangible, right? When we feel resentment and anger towards somebody, sometimes it becomes an action and we want to take revenge on that person. We want to harm that person for what they've done to my family and myself. That is when our sinfulness is truly revealed. David, who's a sinner, who's a human being, should be no different. But there seems to be something that David knows that maybe we might have missed. When David hears the news that Saul died, David could not suppress his sadness, the scripture records. And it says that he ripped off his clothes and made everyone around him fast for hours. This entails that he wasn't just kind of bummed out. He wasn't acting like he was bummed out to be a good person. He was really sad. In the tradition of the Jewish people, if they were to rip out their clothes, it means that they have a loved one who passed away. So David is treating Saul like one of his own, one of his family, and he rips his clothes off. After so much sorrow, David gives the young man who delivered the news not a great reward like he expected, but death, right? Why did David treat this young man who got rid of the person who gave him such a hard time this way? Why wasn't David so happy about Saul's death? The reason for killing the Amalekite shows in verse 14. Can we all read verse 14 together? David said to him, "How is it you were not afraid to put out your hand to destroy the Lord's anointed?" The reason that David killed the Amalekite was because he had killed the one who God had placed over Israel. If David was seeking revenge, if David wanted to kill Saul, he could have done it way earlier. Once in 1 Samuel chapter 24, the second time in 1 Samuel chapter 26, he spares Saul's life. What was different about David's heart that allowed him to act like that? I'll read verse 1 Samuel chapter 26, verse 10 to 11. Okay, do we have one? Oh, there we go. Oh, do we have it? There we go. No, we don't have it. I thought I put it up there. Oh, it's there. Okay, let's read it together. Ready? "As surely as the Lord lives," he said, "the Lord himself would strike him, or his time will come and he will die, or he will go into the battle and perish. But the Lord forbid that I should lay a hand on the Lord's anointed. Now get the spear and water that was near his head, and let's go." In this scene, guys, David is faced with Saul in front of him, kneeled down. One of the commander officers comes to David and says, "Hey, should we kill him now?" And this is how David responds. The Lord will strike him. Rather, in his time, he will come to die, or he will go into battle and perish. But it's up to the Lord, because the Lord has anointed Saul. David's unshakable belief was that humans should not judge someone who God has anointed, even if he has caused them to suffer greatly. I'm going to say that one more time. David's unshakable belief was that humans should not judge someone whom God has anointed, even if he has caused them to suffer greatly. David believed that King of Israel was God's servant and messenger to rule Israel, so he believed that only God could punish him. Famous theologian Charles Spurgeon said this, and I'll put it up here so you guys can see. "There is no attribute more comforting to his children than that of God's sovereignty. Under the most adverse circumstances, in the most severe trials, they believe that sovereignty has ordained their afflictions, that sovereignty overrules them, and that sovereignty will sanctify them all." The young Amalekite must have thought that he understood David so well. After all, David is just a person, right? He's just one guy. What the Amalekite looked over was that David was a man after God's own heart. David understood that, and he believed that God's sovereignty overrules his own sovereignty. The young Amalekite did not miss the opportunity and tried to gain personal benefit, but David was a person who always sought after God's will, even if it was disadvantageous or damaging to him. And that is the reason why he was able to shed tears during Saul's death. Throughout the rest of the verse, verse 17 to verse 26, we're not going to read it together, but it's a song, a poem that David made out of his sorrow. He called this the Lament of the Bow, and is recorded in the book of Jashar. The book of Jashar is a book that cannot be found today. It's not a real book that we have in hands. But it's a book from Jewish culture we know. It's a book that records many historical heroes and events of the Israelites. I won't read the whole verse to you, but let me summarize the verse. David says in the Lament of the Bow, he said that Saul was lovely and admirable. Verse 23, he says this, Saul and Jonathan, beloved and lovely, in life and in death they were not divided. He quotes, he tells the whole nation of Israel that Saul was lovely and beloved. Was he lovely to David? No, probably not. Was he lovely to a lot of people? Probably not, from knowing Saul's characteristics. But it seems that David is remembering the very positive sides in the face of the death of his own enemy. Although Saul caused great pain to David, David praises Saul as a great warrior and a warrior who sacrificed his life for his people as a king of the nation. Verse 22, he says this, from the blood of the slain, from the fat of the mighty, the bow of Jonathan turned not back, and the swords of Saul returned empty. And in verse 25, he says, how mighty have fallen in the midst of the battle. David wanted everyone around him, because it's a historical book that he recorded in. He wanted everyone around him to know that Saul was a great man, that Saul did great things for the Israelites. And because of Saul, the Israelites were able to enjoy stability and prosperity in the land of Israel. The reason why David got the nickname a man after his own heart is right in this poem. David did not remember Saul by magnifying the suffering he had brought to him. But he remembered Saul as a child of God, the king of Israel, that had been placed and chosen by God. You know, many people decide whether that person or this person is good based on their own experiences with them. If I have a good experience with Gina, I'm going to think that you're a good person. If I have a good experience with you, I'm going to think you're a good person. Rather, if it doesn't matter if other people view him as a bad person, as long as I have a good experience with him, I'm going to think that he's a good person. In other words, if I have a bad experiences with a certain person, we tend to magnify that experience and view that person as a whole a bad person. David was a man who was able to see God's sovereignty and God's heart beyond his own experiences and own emotion with other people. When Saul, who gave him a hard time, died, it was right for him to rejoice and throw a heck of a party. But David did not. And if we determine each other's identity, each other's relationship based on our experiences, not like David, but based on our own experiences with one another, the church faces two big problems. There will be pastors who use their power and influence to manipulate the church and the congregation as they see fit. They will use the word of God to support what they want and what they seek after. And the second is that there will be members of the church who are quick to change pastors and change churches because they do not like their style. When we do not recognize God's sovereignty, we will be quick to jump from relationship to relationship, from churches, to people, to pastors and pastors seeking to have a perfect experience with one another. Did God only place pastors and church leaders in our lives? No. He placed your husbands, your wives, your children, and the people that you meet at work in your life. He has ordained them in your life by his sovereign rule, not for your pleasure or gain, but for his glory only. And if we believe that our enemy in life is those who we do not like or we do not get along, we fall into a dangerous trap of living life without God's sovereign order. We live life as we seem fit. Our true enemy, guys, isn't Satan. Our true enemy isn't our people that we don't get along with. Our true enemy is Satan's deceitful words that create jealousy, envy, hatred, revenge, and long bitterness between a certain person, making us believe that our life is so much better off without that person. This kind of deception may appear like the young Amalekites' words bowing in front of David. Right? Remember, the Amalekite came and bowed before David. As if they are for me, as if they care for me, giving me words that I want to hear, the results that I want to listen to. But in the end, destroying the relationship that I need to restore. Destroying the church that I need to go back to. And destroying the community that I need to protect and belong in. I want to end my sermon with telling you guys where we left off with about my mom and dad. When my parents were treated very unfairly by the other Korean adults, I would argue with my parents. It was to the point where it was when I was about in my high school age. I would kind of tell mom and dad, "Hey, mom and dad, if that person does this, if this person does that, you gotta do this. You gotta strike back. You gotta step your foot down. You shouldn't get ignored." And my mom and dad would always respond to me in Korean. They would say this, "현준아, 하나님이 하실 거야." What this means is, "현준, God will do it." When I heard these words, I was convinced that my parents, who seemed to live in constant mistreatment, were silent because they were incompetent and because they were poor. If I'm being honest, I felt that this was simply their way. This was simply an excuse for my parents to tell me because they couldn't do anything about the situation. I always felt that my parents were powerless because they did not speak English. I always felt that my parents were powerless because they had only $300 when they came to the States. But going through the story of David, God has reminded me that I was very, very much wrong. God revealed to me that my parents were silent and that my parents' quietness was not a sign of incompetence, but a sign and an evidence of their love and trust towards a sovereign God who rules over their life. Like David, a life based on love for God may be seen as foolish and incompetent. When we follow God as how it should be followed, we may seem like we're being ripped off by the world. However, we must know that in those moments, it's not a sign of weak Christians, but it's a sign of humble and faithful Christians who put their trust in the providence of God. There came a person from the descendants of David. You guys know him. His name was Jesus. Jesus was fully God, as you guys are studying the book of John. He was fully God and fully man. And he came to the world in flesh. And the ultimate silence was took when Jesus was taken to be crucified on the cross. Though powerful and almighty, though the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords, he did not use his power or voice or authority to take himself down from that cross. Instead, he says that I will drink the cup that my Father gave me in obedience and in sacrifice. Jesus wasn't powerless or incompetent, though the Romans might think that he was powerless and incompetent. But he chose to be powerless and incompetent because of his love for his Father and his love for the lost. Jesus knew God would do it. So at this time, I want us to reflect on the sermon and pray for maybe a minute or two. And then Josh, if you can lead us into a song At this time, I want us to reflect on any of the things that you guys are going through. I don't really personally know because I'm not y'all's lead pastor, so I don't know your situations and what you guys are going through. But I know my church congregation struggles and the situations that they're going through. And if you're living in the States, there's no way you guys don't have struggles, right? You guys all have struggles that sometimes isn't often shared as much as it should. Think of that struggle. Think of a moment, a time in your life where you seem powerless and incompetent, where you feel like, I should do it. The Lord calls us to be in a servant leadership. The Lord calls us to be in the servant leadership like how Jesus was a servant to the people who have abused him. But don't take pride in your humbleness and in your sacrifice, but take pride in God's sovereignty, God's power, God's authority that rules over every single decision that is made in my life.